Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Art Talk Live. I'm Susanne Ebbinghaus, George M.A. Hanfmann Curator of Ancient Art and Head of the Division of Asian and Mediterranean Art, and I'll be the moderator for our program today. As we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. We strive to honor this relationship. Art Talks Live offer an up-close look at works from the Harvard Art Museum's collections with our team of curators, conservators, fellows, and graduate students. These short, interactive talks reveal our latest discoveries, offer a fresh look at old favorites, investigate artists' materials and techniques, and explore big ideas starting from works of art in the collections. Some logistics about today's Art Talk. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, so you will notice that your microphones are muted and your videos are not visible. Instead, we would like to ask you to submit brief questions for our presenter via the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. The presentation will last approximately 15 minutes, and then we'll dedicate 15 minutes to Q&A. I will do my best to get to every question, but we have a large group today, so that may not be possible. You can begin entering your questions as the presentation is in progress, but we probably only answer them at the end. We will conclude the talk around 2:30 p.m. Now I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Joachim Homann, the George and Maida Abrams Curator of Drawings in the Division of European and American Art. Joachim's interests range from medieval works to contemporary art, and he's currently undertaking a comprehensive survey of American watercolors in the collections. But he's also taking the occasional glimpse at drawings by Picasso. His talk today is entitled Feeling Funny, Picasso in 1918. Joachim.
Thank you, Susanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's take a close look today at a precious graphite drawing by Pablo Picasso from the collection of the Harvard Art Museums that very few of us have seen in person. I don't believe that it was included in a very famous, most often referred to exhibition in 1981, Master Drawings by Pablo Picasso at the Harvard Art Museums, or that it was seen in more recent exhibitions here. But it is occasionally called up in the Art Study Center for teaching and by students who prepare for general exams. This drawing shows a 3/4 length figure in a clown's costume. Seen frontally with the head slightly turned to the left of the picture, the figure seems to be leaning back against a wall that's only indicated by a chair rail, or should this be a ballet bar? The drawing is quite beautiful once you look at it closely. Unfortunately, an image of the entire sheet is almost impossible to read because the lines are evenly thin and Picasso refrains from any hatching. It's a little bit like looking at a spider web. The drawing requires patience and focus to come into sight. In this photo, you see it a little stronger than it appears in real life when you look at it. I made it slightly darker. I manipulated the photo a tiny little bit for your viewing. The sheet has a very presentable size that is close to the legal format of American stationery, but wider. When you see it nicely matted, it makes a statement. This is not a scribble. And the quality of the Italian Fabriano paper is immediately apparent. It has a beautiful cream paper tone and a smooth texture that I really enjoy when I look at the work. Picasso's elegant graphite lines are complementing the sheet and bring it to life with their metallic sheen. As I'm looking closely at these sparse lines, I'm surprised and delighted how evocative they are. With great economy, they describe the figure of a Pierrot, a clown originally from the Italian tradition of the Commedia dell'arte and long adopted by French popular entertainment. You probably have seen him in plays or in movies alongside Harlequin. While the colorful Harlequin is an extrovert, Pierrot, clad in white, is an introvert. Pierrot falls deeply in love, but Harlequin steals away the bride. All that's left for Pierrot, often enough, is to gaze at the moon. Like the well-known character of the pantomime, Picasso's Pierrot appears heavily made up and wearing an extremely oversized, probably white costume, and a conic hat with a white brim and a pom-pom that you see here in this detail. Picasso's careful strokes outline the face and delineate its features. Is the face covered in white makeup? At least that's how I see it. Pierrot remains an enigmatic and almost invisible character, and what he presents is just enough to engage your imagination. The Pierrot was occasionally played by female mimes, and the features of Picasso's face seem quite feminine to me. Do you agree? I'm intrigued by the relationship between the features and the shape of the face. They appear enlarged, making this calm and barely articulated face quite expressive and seemingly alert. Just for the fun of it, I'm showing Pierrot's face here with a photo from around 1916 of the Russian dancer Olga Koklova, whom Picasso married in July 1918. The drawing is probably from the winter-spring of early 1918. In the photo, she's dressed for the performance of Afternoon of a Faun. I wonder whether you see similarities between these two faces. We know that this drawing originated in 1918 when Picasso was home in Montrouge, a suburb of Paris, while Olga stayed in a nearby hotel. They were not married at this point. For several months, Picasso painted and drew figures of the Commedia dell'arte, often with the help of models, and he painted a portrait of Olga too, partly based on photographs. It's plausible that he repeated a drawing like the one in Chicago that you see here in the larger, lighter, brighter sheet, that he repeated this drawing and then inserted Olga's face in the drawing that you see on the left in the Harvard collection, just for his and Olga's amusement, perhaps. Once you start tracing Picasso's lines with your eyes, the drawing really turns out to be a lot of fun. How about the effortless notation of the gathered fabric where the collar touches the neck? Somehow Picasso articulates the fabric's pliability, the somewhat careless production of a costume cheaply made for the stage, and at least to me, it also evokes the ethereal movements of the mime during the performance. Quite how much the lines can say about physicality and movement is apparent when you look at the hands of the figure and the folds of the enormously large costume. Graphite lines articulate the almost architectural tension of the hands that, capstone-like, provide stability to the arm's arch. And they visualize the relaxation of the costume's fabric, subject to gravity, and demonstrate their volume and the space around them. Rather than the more typical pantalons, this Pierrot wears a sort of chemise that's cascading down far below the waist. This actually turns out to be one of my favorite details. It's like visual music. When I looked at the Pierrot in the Art Study Center the other day, I had 3 other drawings out on the table next to it. Seeing them side by side was helpful to me to train my eyes. Let's try to translate this experience into Zoom. And I'm starting with the glass, about 4 years older than Pierrot. It seems very straightforward until you realize that the figure, which is the glass in this case, is transparent, but nevertheless is the only part of this composition that's shaded to identify it as 3-dimensional. Picasso drew this work in charcoal, which allowed him to create lines that can be extremely bold, as in the left side of the glass and its foot that seem to lift the object off the paper. Or they are quite tentative, like in the shadow, which seems to flicker. The pencil lines of the Pierrot don't have that expressive quality. But in this case, Picasso uses pentimenti, almost completely erased traces of the drawing's initial stages to animate the work. They are especially visible in the face. These pentimenti indicate that this drawing is an invention, at least I understand it that way. Picasso is known to have on occasion traced photographs, and as we assume, he probably traced from other drawings as well, or repeated other drawings as well, but he did not rely on photography or to outline what he saw or imagined. Another drawing from the collection, The Head of a Man from 1912, is a wonderful example of the collage work that was one of the great inventions of Cubism. Picasso clearly worked with the paper's specific materiality and used textures and graphic elements to his advantage. Looking back at the Pierrot, you now recognize the large capital letters of the paper's watermark, which are on the right upper corner of the sheet, as integral to the work's appearance. There is a harmony between the elegant lettering of the watermark and the silvery lines of the drawing that must be intentional. Even the existence of a figure of Italian Commedia dell'arte on an Italian paper seems to me kind of purposeful. One could argue that this drawing responds to the characteristics of the sheet, color, texture, weight, and watermark, and could not exist on any other paper quite like this. And then there is the signature that was missing from both Cubist drawings we just consulted. It anchors a drawing that otherwise might seem elusive and reminds viewers that the drawing itself is a performance by the artist as much as the mimes play on the stage. The signature anchors a drawing that otherwise might seem elusive and reminds viewers, oh, I just repeated this, of the playful character of this work. You see that it's much darker than the silvery lines of the actual drawing. The third Picasso drawing that makes an interesting comparison is probably the most famous one in the group, his bathers, drawn during Olga's and Pablo Picasso's honeymoon in Biarritz in the summer of 1918, August, early September. A few months after the Pierrot drawing, which falls into the previous winter-spring, as I mentioned. The couple had a small wartime wedding in Paris and then followed an invitation by the Chilean philanthropist and collector Eugenia Errázuriz to spend a couple of months on the Atlantic coast. This drawing, despite its fairly small format, presents 15 female nudes on the beach, beautifully choreographed. This work has earned much praise and is described, to cite just two examples, by Sir Kenneth Clark in his introduction to the very well-known book, The Nude, A Study of Classical Art, 1956, and it's also discussed extensively in John Richardson's Picasso biography. Richardson describes it as Picasso's first rendering of bathers and as a compendium of figures that he further develops in later years. By all accounts, this drawing is a breakthrough, and we are lucky to have it in Harvard's collection. What makes this work so arresting is a tension between its formal complexity and the seeming spontaneity. At the same time, it is very restrained and highly controlled and exuberantly playful, as it interprets human anatomy quite freely. Since the time of its creation, the drawing and the shift in Picasso's formal language that it ushered in has been understood as a comment on Ingres, the French neoclassical artist. Ingres' Turkish bath had been kept off public view in part to protect the public from its eroticism. When it was seen in exhibitions in 1905 and in 1911, at the time it entered the Louvre collection, it sent shockwaves through Parisian art circles. Ingres provided an example for a highly personal reinterpretation of neoclassicism. He was a model how to turn the most academic and stifling artistic tradition inside out and create works that felt urgent and contemporary. The comparison between the 1918 bathers and Ingres' Turkish bath was already such a commonplace in Paul Saxe's days. He was the one who bought this work in the 1920s from Picasso's gallerist, that already Paul Saxe pointed out that Picasso might very well have been inspired by Greek vase painting or, as others claimed, the figurative engravings on the back of Etruscan mirrors. I leave that discussion for another day. For Picasso, escaping wartime Paris with his bride was clearly extremely productive, and the light-hearted bathers established a new path forward for him. You have to promise me to look at this drawing in person once the museum opens to the public again. Ingres' model also has bearings on Picasso's Pierrot. As you know, the Harvard Art Museums boast a very large collection of works by Ingres, and I selected just one of the many portraits that we have in the collection. This a wonderful early portrait of a friend whom Ingres met during his first years in Rome. Madame Ayard was married to the owner of an art supply store who commissioned Ingres to draw quite a few portraits of members of his growing family. The elegance, truthfulness, and freshness of portraits like this was of great interest to Picasso, who in the late teens and early 20s delighted friends, gallerists, and benefactors with portraits in Ingres' vein. For the Pierrot too, this could have been an inspiration. However, Ingres would not have thought of taking on subjects of the performing arts. As far as I know, he was much more about high culture. The enchanted world of Watteau, for example, was distant past for Ingres, a no-go. Watteau's life-size Pierrot is one of the greatest paintings of the 18th century in today's opinion, in spite of or because of its enigmatic character. And Picasso would have, of course, very much known this work from the Louvre collection. And the popular entertainments of the 20th century were equally distant to Ingres' vision, but present for Picasso. Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp might be Pierrot's cousin and was just invented around the time that Picasso engaged with pantomime and with the Ballets Russes. Certainly silent films helped pantomime to have a comeback. I'm just pointing that out here without dwelling much on it. Picasso's idea to look at Ingres, to articulate a response to contemporary popular culture, was an iconoclastic and fun way of acknowledging what was going on in the world and finding an oblique angle to look at it. It sparked an outburst of activity in Picasso's own studio and was greeted with enthusiasm all across Europe. His new Commedia dell'arte works helped to establish neoclassicism, or sometimes called the rappel à l'ordre, or in Germany, neue Sachlichkeit, as a stylistic ideal for the 1920s. In his drawing, Picasso creates the illusion of an athletic, alert, and vulnerable person behind all these ridges and valleys of fabric. Both art forms, drawing and acting, spark the viewer's imagination with an extremely reduced toolbox, limiting himself to pencil and paper and evoking a perhaps already then overused trope of popular culture. Picasso suggests an interiority that I still find perplexing. This figure hangs in the balance between high and low culture, enticing the viewer to pay close attention and let herself be enchanted, without being afraid of being in love with either precious drawings or rough and tumble pantomime. Picasso had engaged with the circus and popular entertainment since at least the Saltimbanque of 1905, so already 1.5 decades ago, and he had most recently painted a Cubist Harlequin as well. That might be a self-portrait of sorts. He painted a Pierrot too, which is unusually colorful and clearly based on a different model that must have posed for Picasso. This is not the same figure as he's using for the drawing that we are looking at. I find the drawing honestly more successful but then I might be biased. In 1917, Picasso associated himself with the Ballets Russes when he was invited by the impresario Serge Diaghilev to design costumes for the ballet Parade. Here is the curtain Picasso painted with assistants and showing figures of the Commedia dell'arte. It is the biggest work Picasso painted, as you can see in this installation photograph from a recent exhibition. One can easily imagine how attractive it was for Picasso to join the production team of the ballet and in-your-face avant-garde performance instigated and scripted by Jean Cocteau, with music by Eric Satie, Picasso's friends, and Picasso's own costumes, stage design, and curtain. To work in such a team of highly creative people would have been a great antidote to the challenges posed by war and the pandemic, the Spanish flu. Picasso, as a Spaniard living in the French capital, was not drafted for the war effort against the German invasion. As he saw off his close friends Georges Braque and Guillaume Apollinaire, who served, he stayed behind in Paris. Apollinaire was then wounded and succumbed to the flu in late fall of 1918. As a Spanish expat, Picasso would have been antagonized by the pervasive nationalism of a society under siege, and he would have been disconnected from the social unrest. But the challenges were real: shortages of coal, sugar, basic staples, and art supplies. He was exposed to occasional bombings by German planes or their new far-reaching cannons. For the arts, Paris must have been an eerie place at the time. Museums were closed and protected their collections off-site. Galleries were shuttered as well. Picasso's biographer, John Richardson, paints a vivid picture of this period in Picasso's life. His account is so detailed and so entertaining that I have to stop myself from paraphrasing passages. Many of you might have read it or parts of it. The period of interest here is covered in his third volume titled The Life of Picasso, The Triumphant Years, 1917-1932. What Richardson lets his readers witness is Picasso's stunningly creative and admirably energetic response to this threatening moment in his life and in history. He found a new support network, as we would say today, in Serge Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, who were in 1917 moored in Paris, themselves disconnected from their home country that was experiencing the Bolshevik Revolution. Among the Ballets Russes, Picasso made many new friends, such as composer Igor Stravinsky and dancer and choreographer Leonid Massine, with whom he set out to work on Pulcinella, the neoclassical ballet that premiered in 1920. They went to Rome and Naples together, and at the Ballets Russes, Picasso even found his wife, Olga. I mentioned that they married in 1918. Parade, the ballet that Picasso worked on, is actually represented in Harvard's collections with a fun costume design of the back of a figure that's called the Chinese conjurer. And you see it on the right side. It's preserved in Houghton's theater collection at Harvard. And the costume you see on the left is at the Victoria and Albert Museum. As concert halls, theaters, museums, and galleries today are closed in response to the ongoing pandemic, the largest one since, or the most threatening one since 1918, the creative class is struggling yet again. While performers such as musicians, dancers, and actors are perhaps hit hardest by the requirements for social distancing, visual artists too are severely suffering. When I proposed this program, I thought that Pierrot had something to offer at this particular moment. He had been the patron saint of the performing arts already in difficult situations before, as we just learned. And I want to add to this that at the end of World War II, Pierrot had helped another generation of Europeans to overcome the trauma and hardship of the war through the beloved film Les Enfants du Paradis. You might know this, and you certainly will enjoy looking at it at this particular moment. I was quite surprised when I opened the New York Times the other day and saw an image that made it click for me. The article introduced the work of theater professionals during the ongoing closure of their companies. How do they keep themselves busy and make a living? The first example was Ty Green, a costume designer from Great Britain who put her skills to good use as she develops a fashion line. The photo that she staged for the newspaper photographer is very resonant with our theme. I contacted her, asking for permission to show the image in my talk, and I'm ending with her response. Ty Green wrote the other day to me, "Dear Joachim, it's quite an uncanny connection that you make between the photograph in the Times and Picasso's Pierrot. Picasso's circus paintings have been very much in my mind lately. And in fact, I have started sketching ideas for graphic design inspired by his circus characters." Picasso brilliantly conveys how the humanity of the performers and the mythical quality of their characters combine in the moment of performance. Pierrot wasn't specifically in my mind at the time of composing the photographs, but the atmosphere of the heartbroken, mute clown is very present in the image and is a truthful reflection of the feelings of most of us in the theater community at the moment. As with most creative processes, I would say that Pierrot was in my marinade of my mind at the time and came through unconsciously. This is the end of the quote. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening in, and I hope that Pierrot is now in the marinade of your minds as well. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joachim, for introducing us to this fascinating drawing and connecting us to the moment we find ourselves in. What a treat to be able to see Picasso's fluid lines close up. I've always thought of them as almost casual, so it was interesting to see that there are pentimenti and to see him erase lines. And I will bite my tongue now, but of course, as the ancient art curator, I cannot help but saying that I think the comparison with Etruscan mirrors is indeed very convincing. But we do have a lot of questions in the chat, so I want to get to them. Let me see. The first question is, the facial structure with the long, large nose and the full lips is very striking and reminds me a little of classical, romantic, or Italian female portraits. Does this face type have an artistic heritage?
Oh, absolutely, and it's a wonderful question about the face that Picasso is developing at this particular moment. Of course, Picasso had a classical training as an artist already from his father, and then through his participation in the academy training, his drawing skills were incredibly highly trained, and he always felt throughout his life that he needed to perform on with the most acuity and skill in order to let things go and liberate himself from it. He kept drawing all his life, and he certainly used his drawings to develop a facial type, especially at this moment, that's very classical. And interestingly enough, he fell in love with Olga, I'm sure for many reasons, but one of the reasons must have been that her face has a very classical composition, and that he used her as a model many times exactly at this particular moment to develop a type of a face that he then used again and again in works that are not necessarily portraits, but renderings of a feminine ideal.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question here that I think in part you might already have answered. The eye is almost immediately drawn to the hands at the center of the drawing. Hands are obviously an important part of clown pantomime performance, but they are very still here, almost reserved or serene. I feel a sense of dignity is given to the clown character. What would be the appeal for artists, or Picasso in particular, to draw Pierrot or other humorous performers? I think I've seen other clowns or court jesters painted by other Spanish artists. That's true, there's a whole tradition there.
That is a wonderful suggestion. Yes, I mean, when you think of Spanish art, Velázquez comes to mind, and the gestures and at the court in Madrid are certainly present on Picasso's mind as well. The French avant-garde, if you think of Baudelaire and many others, had already adopted the pantomime in the mid-19th century as a kind of chosen home for an intellectual environment for them. They always felt that they were slightly on the edges of society. They wanted to live a bohemian life that was associated not with the classical tradition of French theater that was so incredibly regulated, but with the Boulevard de Crime and with the performances that were happening in the kind of lowbrow theaters. So the pantomime played a big role there. And I think Picasso is, with his friends, Satie, Stravinsky, Diaghilev, extremely interested in that. When he visited Italy for the first time, being in Rome and Naples together with Diaghilev and Massin and getting ready for the Paris performance of the Parade ballet, they actually made a point of attending as many of Commedia dell'arte performances, especially in Naples, as they could, because the tradition that they knew only secondhand was still alive in impromptu performances in Naples at the time, and it influenced the whole team, Picasso, Massin, and others for years to come. So it's an affiliation of choice for Picasso to hang out with the performers.
Thank you, Joachim. Another question. Where do you think this painting lies in his journey into Cubism?
Yeah, it is so fascinating that to remember that Picasso had developed his extremely revolutionary Cubist language together with Georges Braque already in the years leading towards the First World War, and continued to work in those years, 14, 15, 16. But as the war took its toll on Europe, his gallerist, who was German by descent, had to go to Switzerland. He couldn't stay in Paris any longer, losing his whole gallery stock, unfortunately. A lot of his supporters who had been investing in Cubism, not knowing quite how well they would be doing, these things kind of fell apart, and he was really looking forward to working with the Ballets Russes as a new kind of creative environment. And at this particular time, he then develops a neoclassical language that is, if you look at it like we did today, you realize it is equally abstract. It's a complete artifice comparable to Cubism, but of course it has a different kind of appeal to many people, and it became a breakthrough development for the arts all across Europe. So this, and then Picasso, as we all know, played with both forms of expression, with the Cubist and with the neoclassical application of his art, and he combined them often even in the same works, which is, I mean, always super entertaining and very, very successful.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, but we do have still quite a few questions. Maybe just very briefly, one question concerns Picasso and Matisse's relationship, that they both were interested in the Ballets Russes, and would you?
Right. I mean, many of us have seen exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York on the relationship between Matisse and Picasso. Clearly, if the John Richardson biography, which is a monumental work, it's easily the most important artist biography of any artist of the 20th century, but it also is so well written that it reads like a soap opera. If you're done with Netflix for a while, look at John Richardson's Picasso biography. And he has a lot to say about the rivalry between Matisse and Picasso, which was actually often used by dealers, for example, to jockey both of them, to get them both to show their best works. If you would tell Picasso that Matisse was bringing out important works, he would have to be the best. They were incredibly competitive. But I also learned a great deal from each other.
Thank you. The very last question remarks on the signature being in a different medium, and wondering, I guess, whether the drawing was first conceived of as a study and then later designated for purchase, for sale, and whether such variations in signatures are more common in Picasso's oeuvre.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful question. Picasso, through the years, placed his, he gave different weight to his signatures. I find that actually a really, really intriguing question. There are in his drawings clearly two different categories of drawings, those that are exclusively for the studio use in order to clarify those works that are making a statement and that they're meant to for the market to be shared with others. And this is clearly a drawing that wants to be seen and wants to be enjoyed. It's the kind of statement. And I find that the affirmative signature is giving for everyone to see the stamp of approval, that this is very and so beautiful that it's easy to dismiss it as a kind of ephemeral product of his imagination. But here is the signature, and it's this is a stylistic ideal that he is working out with these drawings, and he wants us to know about it.
Thank you so much, Joachim, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm not entirely sure whose internet is giving out here. It might be mine, and I apologize. After you leave this session, you will receive a link for a short online survey, which I'll hope you take a moment to complete. We are grateful for your feedback as we adjust to the new normal. We also hope that you will join us for our next Art Talk Live, which will take place on February 2nd, The Abject Object, Decay and Irreverence in Dieter Roth's Multiples by Lauren Hansen. Please note that both the weekday and the time of the day of the Art Talks Live is changing. Starting February 2nd, so that is next week, the talks will take place on Tuesdays at 12:30 p.m. Please visit our online calendar for more information about this and upcoming problems. Again, thank you for joining and have a good day.